we are going to have a media training for journalists focusing on freelancers. So we have Chaacha Mwita, the trainer. Chaacha is a journalism and public policy engagement practitioner with over 15 years experience in journalism and the editorial leadership. He's a senior health journalism trainer for Internews projects. Chaacha worked in leadership position at the Standard Media Group in Kenya, Aga Khan Foundation, East Africa, in the UK-based Thomson Media Foundation, as well as African Population and Health Research Center. So we have him on board as our trainer today. If you have questions, please use your Q&A space to type your questions. We will, the trainer will address them. Thank you. Chaacha, the floor is yours.
It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here today. And Christoph, thank you very much for your wonderful introduction. I had no clue that you know that much about me, and it seems like you have done your research well. Yes, everything Christoph has said, it is true, except one or two things that I shall address later after this training, so that we see whether it is true or not. Because when people mention leadership, a lot of things come to mind. So I hope I would be able to justify that description of me by the end of this training. So we have the other thing I had said, sorry, quickly, that I had forgotten, that I'm hoping this will be a conversation. As Christopher said, please key in your questions in the chat box that Christoph pointed out, and then we will address them. I would like as much as possible this to be a conversation, because this is a topic that is dear to many journalists, and it's one that every journalist I know of has something to say about. So I would really like this to be a conversation, so that we can all be the better off for it. So we have 1 hour. I'll try as much as possible to squeeze everything I have into that 1 hour. I will make a very quick introduction. Then I will, dwell a bit on pitching, just to be able to bring on board or to carry along young journalists who might be in the room. So the old journalists might and experienced journalists might have to bear with me on that. And then we will do potential pitches. I do have my own 1 or 2 story ideas that I would like to share with you and to tease you with them and see how what you think about them. And then finally, I will conclude. Christoph had asked me for a PowerPoint presentation earlier today, and I told him that I don't do PowerPoints because, as one of my professors used to say, it is full of power but has no point. So so it is one of those things that I avoid, because then it restricts the way I talk and the tempo and pace which I take. I would like to talk from notes and from experience. So, and that is exactly what I'm gonna do. So the topic today has 3 very clearly defined challenges. The first challenge is the challenge of the infodemic. That is, a saturation of information on the subject of COVID-19, and the necessary requirement that the topic must be covered and must be kept alive at the front lines of media products. So it's a challenge because there is too much, and within that too much, there is a lot that is not accurate, there is a lot that is false, there is a lot that is misleading, and that makes the work of journalists even more challenging. And as a matter of fact, it makes the pitching of journalists even more challenging. The second challenge, of course, is fatigue. We all know that when a story has been around for a long time, we tend to get fatigued about it, and we tend to get tired of it. And there are dangers, journalistically speaking, inherent in fatigue, where necessary, relevant, important stories are concerned. So this is, for example, a serious health story. And if we develop fatigue around it, we might miss important pieces of information about it that could save lives, that could advance the cause of health. So that right there is a big challenge. So for example, editors don't want to hear about COVID-19, and yet it is an important health story that people need to learn about. The third challenge that has been clearly defined for me is that most of the people on the call are freelance journalists. And freelance journalists have unique challenges. They do not have the direct access that employed journalists, for example, have within newsrooms. And that lack of direct access, that lack of a foothold inside a newsroom with a news desk makes it much the harder for them to be able to pitch their stories. And if they do, they are sometimes in competition with the journalists inside newsrooms. And this presentation has been fashioned to address freelancers and some of the tricks they can use in order to be able to pitch stories that are, number one, some editors consider tired stories, and stories that, number two, are about which there is a lot of information out there. Of course, some of it accurate and correct, some of it inaccurate and incorrect. So that is the intro that I wanted to make, which takes me to the next stage of this discussion, which is a discussion on effective pitching. How do you do effective pitching regardless of what the story is? As we all know, every journalist, whether employed or freelance, must do some pitching. So very quickly, a few tips on how to do a good pitch. So we all know that a great pitch creates interest. If your pitch does not create interest on the part of the editor, on the part of the person who is going to make a decision as to whether or not to carry that story, then that pitch is not good, and you basically have failed. And I think I should say at the outset that failing in pitching is part and parcel of the practice of journalism, which most of us who have been in the trade know. And we shouldn't be discouraged by failing in our first few pitches. The only discouragement should come really when we are mature in the field, and an editor rejects our pitch, which we happen to know very well is talking about a wonderful story. So a good pitch creates interest, and a good pitch provokes the interest of the editors in a story. After a pitch, you should an editor should not be able to say no to you. In other words, you should make it, while pitching, you should make it completely impossible for an editor to say no to your story, which is why it is important for you not to attempt pitching if you are not ready with the story. There is, if you're not ready to do the story, that is, there is some background information that goes into making a pitch. And that background information includes some preparatory work on what your story is. And pitching is not only aimed at the editors themselves. Pitching is also aimed at you, the person who is pitching, at you, the young journalist or experienced journalist who is pitching, because pitching gives you focus. It helps you think through your story. It helps you be precise about what your story is. Because sometimes, and in my experience as an editor, I met a lot of young people who had great story ideas, but they confused those great story ideas with a lot of other things, extraneous things that were outside what the story is supposed to have been. So a good pitch also helps you as a journalist to focus. And ultimately it makes your writing and presentation easier. And we all know that actually pitching for radio and TV is much more sophisticated than pitching for a newspaper. Because in pitching for radio or in pitching for TV, there is a time limit. You are going to pitch a story that you are going to spend 3 minutes pitching a story that, if you are lucky, will occupy 3 minutes of a radio or television news bulletin. So in fact, while you are pitching for it, it's as if you are telling the story itself. So you have to be very precise in it. I used to have a lecturer at the School of Journalism where I went. His name was Magayu Magayu. He has since passed on, and God rest his soul in peace. He used to tell us that when you want to do an effective pitch, you have to think about what the story is. And then he would point at a student, which I would do if we were having a face-to-face conversation, and ask him, the story is, and you tell the story. So the story is that so and so is dead. The story is that such a number of people have died from such a disease. The story is that Africa is having this great number of this exponential increase in the number of people. So what is the story? And that story is actually your pitch. And it does help you to cut out the fluff. One of the things that we forget when we do pitches as journalists, because we are so excited, we have a story and we are so excited, we want to tell it, is that we forget to ask ourselves whether anybody else has covered that story before. And if we do our research and discover that somebody has covered that story before, and we still feel like we need to do something about it, then we should reveal that in our pitch as well. That we know that so and so has covered this story, and these are the dimensions that were covered, and these are the dimensions that were not covered, and this is therefore the value that I am going to add. In other words, what is the story idea? It must be a specific statement of the story that you want to tell. And of course, as a journalist, you must be sure that it is newsworthy and that it is of consequence. What are the consequences of you carrying that story? But more importantly, because you are talking to an editor, what are the consequences of that editor not carrying such a story? And I know that we are talking about COVID-19 here. My brief was very specific. We are talking about Corona, COVID-19. And as I said in my introductory words, we cannot allow a story of great importance as this to fatigue people, to be tired and to be buried under other things that we usually carry. So let editors know what the consequences of not publishing that story is, and let the editor know specifically, to use journalistic parlance, what angle you are going to take in that story, especially if it is a story that has already been covered by somebody else. So just to recap, ask yourself, has somebody else done this story? Number two, if somebody has done this story, reveal the fact that you know that that story has already been done, and reveal the fact that there are angles and dimensions of it that were not covered, which you are going to cover, bearing in mind the newsworthiness and the consequences of carrying and not carrying a story. One mistake that we make as practicing journalists is that we make the mistake of pitching a topic instead of pitching a story. So in the context of what we are saying right now, the topic is COVID-19. Don't pitch COVID-19 as the topic, as your story, because everybody knows that COVID-19 is the story, is the topic. Pitch a story instead. So for example, there is the whole question of vaccines. And we all know, or those of us who have done our research do know that right now, as we are speaking right now, there are over 150 COVID-19 vaccines that are in the making. And out of those, about 7 have potential and are advanced. And out of those, 3 are taking the lead. And so you could ask your editor, do you know, for example, that there are 150 vaccines under development? And if the editor doesn't know, because I tend to think that many wouldn't know, in the competition of for covering, producing the next news bulletin, in the competition for filling up a newspaper with many other things happening, politics happening in our different countries where we come from. And I know that the media is obsessed with politics. And if the politics are not politics of health, if the politics are not the politics of COVID-19, it's highly unlikely that an editor, unless this is an editor who has risen through the ranks from the science field, would know that all those vaccines are being developed. And I'm speaking from experience, because you enter the newsroom in the morning, say at 8, you have to review the yesterday's bulletins and this morning's bulletins. You have to review the day's newspaper and what is happening with the docket. Then you go to 10 o'clock, you have to meet your editors. Then depending on your rank, you have to brief your bosses and debrief your juniors, and then go for lunch, and then come back. It's time to produce the paper or to produce the next news bulletin. And all that goes up to around 10 p.m. when an editor rests. So there are a lot of things I want to emphasize here today, and editors in the room can bear me out. There are a lot of things that skip the attention of editors. And so a story like COVID-19, which is a science story and which has mainly focused on regurgitating figures from governments, has a lot of salient features that editors may not be aware of. So you can ask them whether they know those things. Do they know what a false positive is? Do they know what a false negative is? And which between a false positive and a false negative, which is worse and which is better, and why? And so don't pitch a topic. That is the point I'm making. Don't go telling an editor, I have a story for you on COVID-19. No, go telling an editor about the specific story you have on COVID-19. So that is the first idea I would like to share with you. Has anyone done the story before? And what specifically is the idea? And don't pitch the topic, pitch the story itself. Name the characters when you are pitching a story. That is why I said earlier that you have to do some kind of pre-research and try to create the drama and the action that will be there in the story that you want to do. So you have to pre-research your pitch and make sure that it's spot on. I'm keeping an eye on time, so I want to leave that point there and go to the next point. In effective pitches, there is usually a portion on how you are going to actualize the story. A lot of newsrooms that we work for, especially in Africa, have resource constraints, have resource problems, have other challenges, and editors in the competition for all the decisions that they have to make. You have to make it easier for them to be able to make an instant decision there and then to let you carry on with the job or not to let you carry on with the job. So, sorry.
Allow me to interrupt you when questions comes in.
Absolutely.
So Faith Tani said, not COVID related, talking of the stories that have not been done. I'm looking at the stories on marine resources which have not been explored. What could really be the problem? I don't know if it's a question on some of the...
Yeah. I've seen... okay, so Faith Tanui, I first of all want to apologize for my preponderance towards COVID-19. However, I want to say that whatever points apply to pitching a COVID-19 story are completely spot on for a topic that speaks about marine resources, the question that you asked. So it's we all know the concept of applying points and ideas across sectors and across topics and across subjects and across stories. So it is completely applicable So it's not a problem at all that your interest is in marine resources and not in COVID-19. However, the reason that we are focusing a lot on COVID-19, as I said in my introductory remarks, is because of the infodemic around COVID-19, because of the fatigue around COVID-19, and because of the need to keep the story alive and the need to keep it going so that your audiences can benefit from it. And of course, the ultimate challenge that especially freelance journalists face, pitching stories that have challenges like those, fatigue, infodemic, and stuff like that. So what I was saying about the second story, the second point is how you are going to actualize this story. Please let your editor know, for example, that you have impeccable sources on that story. Let the editor know, for example, that you are willing to do this story exclusively for them. And let the editor know that you have a document that nobody else, for example, has. And for newspaper journalists, please think in terms of pictures. And for television journalists, think in terms of the images that you are going to use to tell the story. In other words, think about the human faces, think about the drama, think about how you are going to dramatize the story. And of course, for radio journalists, it goes without saying, think about the potential sound bites. So in other words, if there is a leading researcher in your country who could speak to this point that you are talking about, and who is well respected and well known and has not spoken for some time, tell your editor that, by the way, I have already secured an interview with Dr. So and so, who is so passionate and who is so qualified to talk on this topic. And I'm telling you, in the editor will look at what you have already done and the fact that you are saying you have unique sources that nobody has. And if it's for radio, for example, you have a soundbite from some senior researcher who is a great person, I guarantee you the editor will tell you, okay, I'll give you 5 minutes. If you are a radio TV journalist, okay, 5 minutes may be too long. I'll give you 3 minutes. And if you are a newspaper journalist or an online publisher, your editor is likely to say, okay, I think if you are approaching it from that point of view and you have this source and this kind of approach, I will give you a page. I will give you 5 columns, whatever it is that the editor uses as a measure of value. So make sure in your pitch, you state the idea clearly and you state how you are going to actualize it, referring to sources and characters and the tensions that the story is going to have. Number 3, you have to have a time aspect to it. So say you can get the story to the editor in a week, because sometimes the stories that we are pursuing are complicated and editors may not necessarily be excited by them. So you want to excite the editor that you can deliver it within a certain time period. And so, put a time period to it and explain why now. So when we talk about time, it includes now. Why is the story important now? And I know that as I speak, because I've spent 27 minutes already, and you perhaps suspect that you'll take 27 minutes to pitch. No, you won't. We will do an actual pitch. You should be able to say everything I'm saying in less than the 1 minute that the editor has given you to talk to him. So think about time. And in terms of time, I have 2 emphases to make. Number 1, give the editor an idea of when he or she can get his story. And number 2, emphasize why now, why the time is right, why the time is ripe for your pitch. Because if you don't give them those 2 dimensions of time, they may ignore you, because it's timeless. He has limited resources. He can invest some of those resources in doing other stories and come back to you if he has to at all, next week or the week after. So it's not important. So you have to put a time frame to it. And You have also to let him know why you have to be the one to do the story. And by the way, this is a very important point. When I was sitting in some of those offices where people sit, I used to ask, in a fair-minded way, why the journalists, the freelance journalists pitching or posing a story to me, why they think that they are the ones to do the story. Because if you are honest with yourself, media houses have journalists they have employed, and they are paying them salaries to do stories. Why should an editor tell a freelance journalist to do a story and pay that freelance journalist when he's already spending money, or she's already spending money on in-house journalists? So it's highly important and highly necessary that you, as the pitcher, convince the editor why you are the one to do that story, so that the editor does not just give away your story to an in-house staffer. And how do you do this? What are some of the reasons that you can give the editor? One of the reasons you can give the editor is your experience in the area. Another reason you can give the editor is the sophisticated nature of the story that you are doing. So, for example, it is on COVID-19. You are the only person who has the right skills to tackle a story like that with accuracy and exactitude. So, you have to tell the editor that you are a science journalist who has cut his teeth or her teeth in the field of covering science, and especially in covering COVID-19. By the way, I know there are a lot of journalists who have been covering other topics, and now they have started to cover science because of COVID-19, because that was the only story there was to tell. So most journalists, crossed over to cover that field. The other thing you can tell the editor is credibility, that of all the science stories you've written, none of them has had an issue. None of them has put the newspaper or the various publications you've written for in trouble. So you have to kind of blow your own trumpet and blow it effectively within a short time. So and you have also to demonstrate energy and passion, because if you don't demonstrate energy and passion, which brings me to my fifth point, the editor will not. In fact, we all know that in most cases, and in things that have to do with life. So for example, look at instances, for example, instances of love. When you are in love, you depict energy and passion, and you pursue, and it comes out in your voice, it comes out in your in the way you present yourself. Look at the way for those of us who love food, look at how we approach food. We approach food with passion and energy. And look, for those of us who have been interviewed for jobs, look at how we approach the interview with a lot of energy and a lot of passion. And unfortunately for journalists, especially freelancers, this is something they have to do over and over and over again. So you have to do it with passion and energy, so that you can attract and hold the attention of your editor. Fifthly, and this is my last point, you have to address the question of so what. If you don't address the so what question, so yes, I have said all these things. I have told the editor what my story idea is. And if it is an idea that has been covered before, I have said what hasn't been touched on. I have adhered to newsworthiness and consequences and explained my angle very well. I have pitched a story indeed and not a topic. I have told my editor how I'm going to go about pinning together the story. I have told my editor about the impeccable sources I have, about the fact that it's likely to be a scoop. I have told my editor about the time I'm going to spend on the story and why it is important right now. I have told my editor why it is me who must do the story and nobody else. Ultimately, so what? The so what bit is what makes the editor make the decision to tell you to go ahead or to give you angles that you could include in your story and follow, or to give you further ideas on your story. In other words, the so what is what actually makes your editor care about the story. You have to make the editor care about the story. So the so what could be something like how many people are likely to die if out of misinformation or disinformation. The so what could include for certain newsrooms how many more people are going to buy their newspapers or listen to their station if they carried that story. The so what includes how many more journalists within newsrooms, because journalists, by the way, learn from each other and they take story ideas from each other. So how many journalists in their newsrooms are going to be able to benefit from the information that you will gather and publish in that newsroom, and therefore make the editor not be coming back to you. In other words, enhancing the journalistic skills of a specific media house. That also is a role of great journalists. So you have to respond to the question of so what, and ultimately explain what steps you have already taken. Make him or her see that this is a story you are passionate about, this is a story you have already invested in, and a story that you are going to do anyway. So, and it could include, of course, telling the editor that if they are not interested in it, you might as well take it to your competitor. A lot of times freelancers do not understand the power that they have. Freelancers are very powerful, especially when they have scoops. So any editor you tell that you might give that story to somebody else if they do not consider it. If that editor knows that they do not have the skills, leave alone the resources, newsrooms have money, but if they do not have the skills inside to do an important story like the one you are pitching to them, they will most likely tell you, please go ahead and pitch it and don't discuss it with somebody else. So I would like to hold a break there and invite any questions that you might have, because I want us to go straight into a few. I told you I have one or two story pitches myself, and I want to hear from you as to what some of the story pitches you might have are, including what problems you might have pitching those stories, so that this is a useful interaction where you leave me with something and you go away with something from me. Thank you. So, Christoph, back to you.
There's a question from Gideon Kwame. So should I say that the so what should talk about the impact of the story?
Absolutely. The so what could include the impact of the story and a number of other things that I mentioned. So the straight answer is yes, the impact of the story, the impact of the story on the audience, the impact of the story on the publication that you are pitching for, and the impact of the story on the field itself, the field of science. And I have seen a wonderful comment from one of my colleagues here, which for those of you who might not be able to access the chat from Zarina, which says she cannot stress enough that journalists must write the story they pitched, not change it after the commission. And that is a very wonderful point, because a lot of journalists pitch a different story and they go and do a story that they have not pitched, sort of tricking an editor to publish a different story from the one that they pitched. And by the way, that undermines your integrity with your editors and with the publications for which you are freelancing. So if an editor, if you pitch a story and an editor tells you to go ahead with that story, make sure you submit, you write the story that you have pitched. Thank you, Zarina.
Okay, another question from Agan Daniel from Mesha, Kenya. Can you say more about the impact? What's the impact that you was talking about? Thank you.
Yeah, so the impact that I was talking about was in response to a question by Gideon, Kwame, who said, so can we say that the so what question talks about the impact of the story? And I said yes, it talks about the impact of the story, and that impact could be the impact on the audiences, it could be the impact on the publication itself, it could be the impact on the field of science itself. So impact should not be viewed in the narrow sense of impact on the freelancer himself who is going to earn a bit of money from the story. No, it should be viewed broadly, and it should actually especially encompass the impact on the audiences themselves, because whatever we do as journalists, we do it for the public good and we do it for the audiences that we serve.
From another question from Lam Chaba. I sent a question in the email, but it's I think it can be another topic to talk about. How do you approach your source of information to cover COVID-19 stories?
Sourcing is a common problem. It's actually a very good question. Sourcing is a common problem in covering any topic, really, not just a science topic, not just COVID-19. It's a common challenge. Let me use the word challenge. It's a common challenge. So the thing is this, that covering health is a public service. In fact, there is one lady here whose motto, who's running motto in her emails, I usually read it, is that good journalism can save more lives than medicine, because journalism, especially health journalism, is some kind of preventive, a preventive action against ignorance. When people know, for example, when people know, they take precautions, and when they take precautions, they do not contract illnesses, they do not contract diseases, because they have taken precautions. So when you have a health story and your problem is sourcing, you must look for the experts in the field, because those are the people who are likely to give you information that is likely to be of greatest use to your readers and to your listeners and to your viewers. In other words, don't go, for example, to what I would call conspiracy theorists. So, for example, you want to do a story on COVID-19, and you are going to a local preacher who has said that COVID-19 is a punishment from God. Fine, it may be a punishment from God if that is what you want to believe. However, what do we do? Because I believe that God himself gave us intellect and intelligence to use. What do you do to avoid catching it? Now, what you do to avoid catching it is not a question you are going to ask that preacher, because, by the way, before you ask that preacher, you know the preacher will ask you to pray about it. So what you are going to do is to source from the experts in the field. You are going to have to find a real scientist. Whether that scientist is a believer or not, he is the expert, he or she is the expert in that field. So I would just like to respond to that question by saying, if sourcing is your greatest problem, we can always do another seminar on sourcing. However, the basics of sourcing are: go to people with the right information. Don't go to people who may not have the right information, even if they may sound authoritative. So, for example, the case of a preacher versus a researcher and a scientist.
Thank you. Another question from Peter Gutworth. If I have pitched a story that my editor needs the positive part of the story, while your characters give you negative impact of it, what can I do as a journalist?
Well, that too is another wonderful question. And it is a rare question in journalism, because we know that in this profession and craft of ours, if it doesn't bleed, it doesn't lead. In other words, we are always looking for negative stories. So first of all, I would like to say to the asker of the question that wonderful. if you work for an editor who usually asks you to look at the positive side of things and the positive side of stories, I am really glad that such editors exist. And I would like to say that the work that some organizations, including Internews, have done over the years seems to be bearing fruit, where editors are beginning to ask for positive stories. So if you have a positive, if you are pursuing a story that must have a positive dimension, and your sources are only giving you negative dimension, I think part of the work of a journalist is to be a magician. So you have to milk the positive aspects of the story from your sources. And one of the ways of milking the positive aspects of a story from your sources, in order to satisfy your editor, remember you are a freelancer and your editor wants a positive story, is asking questions in a very clever format. So for example, if you know a positive dimension to a story, so for example, has COVID-19 brought families closer together, you could pose a question like that. So it's not an open-ended question. It is a question that sort of forces the respondent you are posing the question to answer it in a positive way. And everybody has the capacity to answer questions positively. So it goes back to your interviewing skills, another skill that perhaps some of us need to learn, not all of us, because I see quite a number of experienced journalists on the call. So it goes back to your interview skills, paraphrasing things, teasing things from different dimensions. So that is one of the things that that you could do.
Thank you, Kiundu Wawelu. Our colleague is adding some spices. I wish you read it from the Q&A.
Yeah, so I've seen it. Thank you, Kiundu. Kiundu wants to add that the pitch also applies to when one is applying for story grants or fellowships. Now, I cannot emphasize this enough. So there are opportunities for applying for fellowships and grants for journalists to pursue stories. And we actually run quite a number of them and have been doing it for a long time. So these ideas that we have discussed here, Kiundu says, they also apply in story grants and fellowships applications. Internews has recently judged the Earth Journalism Investigative Grants applications. And unfortunately, we found that most of the pitches, even from experienced journalists, not so well turned out to be focused. As I said when I was referring to my wonderful late professor, what is the story? In fact, before you pitch, for me, that was the best pitching story I ever got. It was in the context of editing. Sometimes editors receive stories where the story is actually buried inside. It is not at the intro. So my professor was teaching, how do you find an intro to a story, which in essence is the best pitch for the story? You ask yourself, the story is that 39 people have died in a car accident. That is the story. The story is not that the car was speeding. The story is not that the road is bad. The story is not that the driver was drunk, because all those are part and parcel of the story, and they will come deeper in the story. However, the story is that 39 people, or in the context of COVID-19, 39 people have needlessly lost their lives because of failing to observe protocols. Full stop. That is the story. So don't pitch a topic. Pitch a story. Don't tell us you are going to do a story on the environment. Everybody knows that the environment is a hot topic. Tell us you are going to do a story on deforestation in Mau and or wherever that is. Tell us you are going to do a story on the impact of the melting ice cap on people who live in Iceland. Don't tell us stories about the environment. Everybody knows it's there. Don't tell us you are going to pitch a story on poverty. Everybody knows poverty is prevalent. Tell us the story of how pitch a story about how a young woman has had to fight poverty and feed so many orphaned children until that woman has been discovered or recognized by the United Nations or something like that. So pitch a story, don't pitch a topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Uthep is asking for some notes.
Okay, I'll make out some notes and share. Yeah, so please put your questions in the Q&A. What I was going to say in the last part of this session is to actually tease out some story ideas that I feel have not been covered. Remember, one of the challenges that that we defined at the beginning of this conversation is the challenge of what do you pitch in COVID-19 that has not been covered, that has not been heard, because information on COVID-19 is prevalent out there. It is all over the place. It's one of the challenges that we have to address. And people tend to believe, a lot of journalists have spoken to recently, which is why this session is important, have sort of implied that there is nothing more to be told, nothing exciting to be told on COVID-19. And I wanted to spend the next 10 minutes or so, or even 5 minutes, so that I can also hear from you, to look at some of the stories that I think we need clarity. On. And of course, my all-time favorite is the vaccine is the vaccine story, because usually when vaccines are being developed, it takes a long time for vaccines to be developed and to be actually certified and be allowed to be utilized across the world, widespread among many people. And in the case of COVID-19, we all know that this infection hasn't been around for more than a year now, because the first outbreak was reported in December last year, and we are now in November, so we haven't quite hit a year. And yet there are vaccines, there are candidates that are ahead. So we need to educate our people on vaccines, and this is a broad topic. It includes what is a vaccine. Of course, we all know what vaccines are. What types of vaccines are there? Because there are different types of vaccines. There are vaccines that use the actual virus. There are vaccines that use part of the virus. There are vaccines that use an element of the virus, like a protein of the virus. And all these stories may sound a bit complicated, but they are not quite as complicated to tell. Remember your pitch. If you do your research, you are able to pitch a story like that. And what is the cost of this vaccine? So, for example, some of us live in the third world. I told you we have over 7 candidates that are now at an advanced stage, and I can quickly mention them. There is the Oxford vaccine, also known as the AstraZeneca vaccine. There is the Moderna vaccine. There is the Pfizer vaccine. There is Sinovac that is being developed by scientists from China and Brazil. There is Sputnik. Those of you who are interested in space science know that there was a Sputnik once from Russia. So Russia is developing a vaccine they call Sputnik 5. So we don't know what Sputnik 1 to 4 is, but I suspect it's that thing that was in space. So this is Sputnik 5, a Russian vaccine. There is Covaxin, which is being developed in India. So do you know that the so-called third world, including India and Brazil, are also in the race for developing vaccines? And lastly, let me name the Novavax that is also being developed by some US institution in Maryland. So there are many vaccine candidates. Which of these vaccines could work best for your location? In other words, find a local dimension to all these vaccines. So for example, we do know that the AstraZeneca vaccine comes at a pricey cost, and its accessibility may be a problem. Its storage is a huge is a huge challenge, and transporting it from wherever it is manufactured to wherever it is to be administered might be a big challenge. Not to say that it's not a great vaccine for Africa. It is, but when you tell a story and point out some of these things, and when you pitch a story and point out some of these things, you actually are likely to pique the interest of your editor, and that editor is likely to make this a much bigger story, an in-depth story, than even you, the journalist, wanted it to be. So,
thank you,
I don't
Chaacha.
know what people think about a story like that. Questions, discussions.
Okay. Please, I have launched the poll. Kindly let us have your feedback. So there is another question from Norberi Nyuzahayo. What the recommendation can you give when someone want to pitch the story of COVID-19?
Absolutely. So Norbert, thank you for that question. I would like to say, find the specific story angle. Please don't say your story is COVID-19. No editor is going to listen to you when you say that your story is COVID-19. Say, for example, another of my example is, say, for example, that it has been discovered in your country that there are many cases of false negatives that people have tested, like we have seen in many instances, that a person tests for COVID-19 and they turn out to be negative, and they go around partying thinking that everything is well. A few days down the line, they are lying in bed with ventilators on their noses, and they have infected other people with the virus because there was a false negative. On the other hand, we've heard of people who have tested positive, and then 2-3 tests down the line, they are negative. So because when you test positive, the recommendation is that you test again. So if you test again and find that you are negative, then you test again and find that you are negative, then you test again and find that you are negative. The first one, which was positive, is called a false positive. And in science, especially in circumstances like now, you should make your editors understand a false positive is better than a false negative, because a false negative results in many more transmissions and infections to other people, while a false positive does not, because once you test positive, your natural instinct is to take precautions so that you do not transmit this to other people. So, Norbert, what I would say is find a story angle and pitch that angle. Don't pitch the topic, which is COVID-19. Pitch the story itself. False negatives, false positives. Which one is more dangerous than the other? Which one is more important than the other? Why is it important that you should do the story? Why is it important that the story is important now? So, for example, that story would help people make better decisions to observe the protocols. Thank you.
We are close to the end. In the meantime, I want to let you know that there's a question in the poll or what they want to hear about in the next session. I think vaccine reporting strategy is reading in other topics. Next training will focus on vaccine reporting strategy. So if you have some last words, kindly Chaacha let us know before we wrap up.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Christoph. I would like to conclude with just a one-liner. Okay. Of course, after saying thank you very much for attending, it was a pleasure having you, and so on and so forth. I would like to have more time to talk about this. I have just one last one-liner, and it is this: a freelancer who cannot pitch a story is a dead journalist, because freelancers have more unique challenges than journalists who work for media houses. So every freelancer should prioritize pitching and refine their pitching. That is the only way they can put food on the table. Otherwise, they are dead. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for participating. So you will get the recording not later than tomorrow, Friday. Thank you so much. Goodbye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, people. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.